Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon or evening, depending on where you happen to be. My name is Hayyim Angel. I'm the National Scholar for the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals, and also teach Tanakh at Yeshiva University, advanced undergraduate Tanakh courses. And it's great to be back with Torah in Motion again. I thank Rabbi Kelman, who I know is teaching himself right now somewhere else. So here I am, and I understand that this is just an ongoing bonanza of shiurim that you can get, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing about Torah in Motion and just the technologies that we have available in general. So I'm in for a 6-part series as a pre-Shavuot smorgasbord of basically a lot of the different biblical readings that we do over the course of Shavuot. So the game plan is today, 10 Commandments. Next week, the rest of the Revelation narrative. Then we move on to the Haftarot of Yechezkel and then Habakkuk. And finally, a 2-part razzle-dazzle Megillat Rut. And then we are done, and bam, it's Shavuot. And that's what's going to happen. So I look forward to learning with you throughout all of the process. So we start with the 10 Commandments. So I don't need to tell you, this is maybe it sounds sacrilegious, but I'm going to say it anyway, even on Zoom, and even though it's being recorded, terrible way to start. This is easily and by far the most important Torah reading and the most important reading of the Tanakh, period. Without the revelation at Sinai, the rest of Tanakh doesn't happen, doesn't exist, and doesn't matter. This is really what it is all about. It is the single most important point of all of our national covenant with Hashem. Because without the Torah, all of a sudden, even Pesach doesn't exist because Hashem isn't commanding Pesach anymore. So that's a good starting point. So I don't know about you, Sidurim these days have gotten really thick. Like, when I was a kid, my Sidur party I still have that Sidur, by the way, from kindergarten. It's all beat up and I've not used it in a very long time, but I do have it on my shelf. It's a couple hundred pages with really big font because, hey, I was 5. All right, so now you get a Sidur in the pews. It's like over 1,000 pages. It's ginormous, right? And because Baruch Hashem, there are so many different prayers and readings and Torah readings, and sometimes they put Tehillim in there. They got it all. So here's a game you can play, and that I have played. Let's say you finish the Amidah in synagogue before the Shliach Tzibur, before the reader does. So what do? So I don't talk. It's wrong to talk in synagogue, of course. I don't like bringing a different book to read in synagogue because I think that when you're in synagogue, you pray. Although if you bring Torah-related books, it's at least within the spirit of what you're doing there. But I don't do that. So all I have in front of me is my Sidur. So a game to play, which you can only play once per edition, is let's see if I could find the 10 Commandments in under 3 minutes. Because there's 1,000 or so pages in there, and the 10 Commandments has to be in here somewhere, and you're not allowed to cheat and look at the Torah reading for Shavuot. That's not fair. That's the easy way. So you have to try to find it in the prayer liturgy. And the truth is, in these ginormous Sidurim, you actually will find it eventually as part of a series of optional readings that some pious people do. But that just begs the question, which is why I thought this would be a good way to start our 10 Commandments shiur. Why in the world don't we say this every day? It's more important than everything else put together. Like if I had to pick one reading, the Shema is good too. I'm all good with the Shema as being another really important reading that we should say daily. You don't need Chazal to figure out this is really central to our beliefs, to our observance, to our relationship with God. Shema is great. But throw in the 10 Commandments too. And that seems to make so much sense that I can't believe it's not in the Sidur. So I like asking this question in a live audience situation because, of course, people will throw back in my face, who is to say that the prayers are designated on the basis of importance? Maybe the prayers are trying to create an experience, and the fact that the 10 Commandments is really important shouldn't get in the way of the fact that maybe it just doesn't belong to the Sidur. Perfectly good objection. I love when people do that. But see, that's when I get them with this nice catchy moment where I point out that in the time of the temple, they did recite the 10 Commandments daily. It was part of the daily service. Now, I am told, I know I sent this to Rabbi Kelman, but do you all have the source sheets that I sent? If anybody doesn't, this is a fabulous time to just say in the chat, please help, I need the sources, because otherwise I'm really going to assume that you all have them, and then I'm just going to read them. Please, if you have your screen on. Oh, you're talking to other people.
Don't have them.
You don't have them? Okay. What I'm going to try to do. Oh, hold on. I don't want direct message. I need the sources.
Can you share screen?
I can share a screen, but then I won't be able to see too many of you, and that always makes me sad. On the other hand, that's what I'm going to have to do because I don't see how else I can.
We don't have the sources, so it's like
I know I'm going to
right.
do that.
Yeah.
They
I'm
were
trying.
in the sign-in sheet.
I know you
They-
should have gotten them, but that doesn't mean much. Hold on. Here we go. Here you go. I'm sharing. Voila. Okay, so now I can't see you, so just keep that in mind. And I also won't be able to see the chat until much later, but I do have that. Okay, source number one is the Mishnah in Masechet Tamid. So here we go. The superintendent said to them, pronounce one blessing, and they did so. This was actually the order of service in the temple. They then recited the Ten Commandments. Hello, the Ten Commandments makes the big time. And the first, second, and third sections of the Shema. Okay, so the Shema is also a very ancient part of our liturgy. And they blessed the people with three benedictions, namely true and firm and avodah and the priestly benediction. On Shabbat, they added a benediction to be said by the watch which was leaving. Very good. Let's focus on the fact that the Ten Commandments was part of the daily service in the temple. Now, I don't need to tell you that the reason why our Siddur is so long is because over the generations and over the millennia, prayers get added, but it is incredibly hard to imagine prayers falling out. Once a prayer is in there, it becomes hardwired into our custom and our tradition, and then we say them, which is all good. But how in the world did the Ten Commandments fall out? It's not some marginal poem that was added by some later Paitan, and at some point you just need to choose which poem should you recite. We're talking about the heart and soul of our entire Tanakh. How in the world could that ever come out of the service? So the Talmud explains that it's because of those pesky heretics. Somebody suggested in the chat before I lost my ability to see the chat. I'll see it later, toward the end, but with share screen, you can't do both. It's tough. So in the meantime, maybe it's because of the Karaites. The answer is no. It goes much further back than the Karaites. The Karaites began in the 8th, 9th centuries CE. But in the time of the Talmud, there were sectarian groups. It wouldn't shock me if this includes early Christians, but it might include other groups as well. There were plenty of sectarians to go around. So the Talmud reports on this Mishnah in source 2 in Masechet Berachot. They recited the Ten Commandments, the Shema, the sections, and it shall come to pass if you diligently hearken, and the Lord said, true and firm, the Avodah. These are all it's just quoting the Mishnah that we saw in source number 1, and the priestly benediction. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, outside the temple, also, people wanted to do the same, meaning after the temple service was done, there was no more temple. They wanted to continue this service, but they were stopped on account of the insinuations of the Minim. So these are these heretical sectarian groups, probably again, including early Christians, but also I'm sure other groups would fit this bill, that the Ten Commandments were the only valid part of the Torah. So you had these sectarian groups saying that God revealed the Ten Commandments, but God did not reveal the rest of the Torah. So that is so offensive to the rabbinic tradition that God revealed the entire Torah, that the rabbis decided to cut the Ten Commandments out of the prayer service so nobody should think it's more important. Remarkable that they changed, not only did they change the liturgy, but they changed the heart and soul of the liturgy. The Ten Commandments itself fell out as a result of that. So this is staggering that Rabbinic Judaism had to change its own tradition. And in this case, the tradition makes so much sense. It's painful to imagine that we lost it, all because these sectarians were causing so much harm. You should also know that in the history of later Judaism, the Ten Commandments fell out. Some retained it as a pious custom, which is why I could play that game that I mentioned before, where after the formal shacharit, the mandatory prayers, some people also say. It became a pious thing to do, but it's certainly not required part of our service. The reality is most synagogues still have the custom to stand when the Ten Commandments are recited, both in Parashat Yitro and on Shavuot, and for that matter in Parashat Vayetchanan in the summer when we also have the alternate version of the Ten Commandments. So Rambam, Maimonides, when he was the rabbi in Cairo, ruled against that. He said that we should not stand for any Torah reading because the second we stand for some, what we are saying is that we're saying this is more important than the others. And don't you remember this passage that we read in source number 2 about those miserable heretics? Okay, so Rambam in his synagogue mandated that all Torah readings are recited with everybody sitting down. because all Torah readings are equally divinely revealed, and therefore they must be treated with equal respect. Most communities still disagreed and said, look, the reality is this is way more important than any others. And what we are saying, those communities who stand are obviously saying, this passage is more important, not that the other passages are less important. This is not a word game. This is a fundamentally important distinction. We obviously view the entire Torah as of infinite worth, divinely revealed, but simultaneously, those communities who have the custom to stand do so because they all realize that this passage is more important than all the others. But the message of this part of the shiur is that it's amazing that as a result of these heretics, we cut really one of the heart of the central prayer out of our prayer book. And I'm not criticizing the rabbis. They did the right thing, obviously. Clearly, these heretics were causing a lot of harm. But it's important to realize that sometimes our own authentic drum to which we should march is harmed as a result of the reactionary component of our tradition. So I think that's just an important zone of understanding the Ten Commandments in our Siddur. Okay, that's part one. Now we're moving to a totally different topic. I'm not continuing those heretics anymore. They're done. We're now moving on to the next question, which I am very fond of, which is how many commandments are in the Ten Commandments? On Shavuot, or any time before or after that, you can go yourself. We're not going to have time to do that in a one-off, but if we had more time, we would just sit down and walk through the passage that we call the Ten Commandments. And what's a commandment? You must do this, or you must not do that. Those two types of things are commandments, what we call positive and negative commandments, or in Hebrew, mitzvot aseh, mitzvot lo taseh. That's it. No matter how you choose to count, you will not find 10. I guarantee it. Try it. Try it after the shiur. You'll see. There's no way. The standard number is around 13. But, you can come up with 14 or 12. It could vary depending on whether you count this or that mitzvah as one commandment or a couple of them. There are a few where it's really unclear how many commandments there are. So you can figure out for yourself how you get to 10. But you don't get to 10. There's no way. I don't know how many people are on the thing anymore. Let's check. Participants, 81. There are 81 of you, and I think I'm one of those. There are 80 other people on the shiur at the moment. None of you are going to get 10, almost guaranteed. It's sort of like all those funny questions that you could ask to stump people, which is just cruel, but also funny. Like, what country did Panama hats originate in? The answer, of course, is Ecuador. Why didn't you know that? So there are all kinds of really fun questions of that variety. So how many commandments are in the 10 Commandments is right on in there. As the number should be 10, of course, but it's not. So how in the world did we get this idea that there's 10 commandments if there's not? So the answer is that even though I will continue to use the term 10 Commandments because that is our convention, Aseret HaDibrot, which is the Hebrew in Rabbinic Hebrew, or in the Torah it's called Aseret HaDevarim, means the 10 statements or the 10 utterances. Within the Torah, there are 10 utterances, and some of these utterances contain one commandment, others contain more than one commandment, and some of them contain 0 commandments. Like, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. No commandment there. It's simply an introduction. Like, God is not commanding us to do or not do something in that statement, at least according to most. So the real proper translation into English would be something along the lines of the 10 utterances or the 10 statements, but certainly not the 10 commandments. That is an utterly wrong translation. The idea that there are 10 utterances is something that appears explicitly in the Torah. If you look at source number 3, it appears a couple of times. We do get the number 10 associated with this. He was there, referring to Moshe, with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He ate no bread and drank no water, and he wrote down on the tablets the terms of the covenant, the 10 commandments. Okay, so the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society translation, retains the convention of the 10 commandments. But the Hebrew is Aseret HaDevarim, right? The 10 utterances, or the 10 things, or the 10 statements. Those are all proper translations, but it's most certainly not the 10 commandments. That's simply a mistranslation. You should be aware of that. But it matters in terms of how we understand what we're reading, that in fact, these are the central 10 utterances that were positioned onto 2 tablets, but it has nothing to do whatsoever with the number of commandments in them. Okay, well, let's move to the 10. This is the traditional Jewish way on the top of the page here. that we have done it. If you go to just about any synagogue in the world, I mean, some of them just have the letters Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, but most of them put on like the first 2 or 3 words of each of these respective statements. And this is how they would be lined up, obviously, in Hebrew. Okay, so in English, here they are. So the standard understanding of, well, you have 10 utterances or 10 statements, and there are 2 tablets. So if you pull out a standard calculator, how many statements were on each tablet? The answer typically comes to approximately 5. And the way that it is understood in nearly every synagogue in the world with the artwork is that you have the first 5 over here, 1 through 5 are on the right-hand side because it's in Hebrew there, and 6 through 10 are on the left-hand side. Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, one of the greatest commentators of all time, he lived in 12th century. Well, he started off in Spain, and then he went to a lot of other countries and led a very difficult life, but he ended up in France and Italy and even England. I mean, he really got around Europe for various reasons. Ibn Ezra has a wonderful and truly breathtaking introduction to the 10 Commandments in his commentary, which is surprisingly long for him. He tends to write very briefly and oftentimes even cryptically. But in this case, he really goes for it. So he comes up with a really interesting way of framing the whole picture. He says like this: commandments can be broken up into different categories, according to Ibn Ezra. One type of category is thinking. There are certain commandments that we are required to think certain things or not think other things, right? There are certain thought commandments. Then there are certain commandments that primarily pertain to speech, where you say things or don't say things. And then there are certain commandments that you do or don't do. They're action commandments. So Ibn Ezra breaks up commandments in general into these 3 categories: thought, speech, action. Okay, so let's check it out together. I'm just going to tell you what he says, but because of the nature of Zoom, I'm the Lord your God, which Ibn Ezra, like Rambam after him, Maimonides, we'll get back to this point later, hopefully. He takes that to mean this is a thought commandment. There's a belief in our one God. That's the first statement. And the flip side, which is also primarily a thought one, is don't believe in any other gods. Don't worship them. Don't serve them. Obviously, there might be words or actions associated with idolatry. But primarily, this has to do with our beliefs, that we believe in one God, we don't believe in any other gods. Okay, so he understands that the first 2 commandments or the first 2 statements are primarily thought related. Then we move on to the third one: do not take God's name in vain. That is at least primarily a speech related commandment. Then we have Shabbat and honoring parents, which are primarily action related. Ibn Ezra follows the standard rabbinic party line that these 5 statements on this side, 1 through 5, are primarily between man and God, what we call in Hebrew ben adam lamakom. So he argues that when it comes to serving God, the most important thing is what we think and what we believe. Next most important is what we say. Third most important is what we do. They're all important. Don't get me wrong, and don't get him wrong. But in terms of just the pecking order of the 10 statements, or the 10 commandments as we call them, the order of serving God is thought, speech, action. Then we flip over to the other side, where we're dealing primarily with ben adam lachavero, commandments that govern our behavior with other people. Do not murder. That is primarily a commandment of action. Specifically, don't act in a certain way. So too with do not commit adultery, and so too with do not steal. These are all action-related ones. Then do not bear false witness. Well, that's primarily speech. And finally, do not covet, do not desire, and that which does not belong to you. That's primarily thought. So Ibn Ezra notices that at least in his frame of reference, the way that he schematizes everything, when it comes to our conduct vis-a-vis God, it's the thought that matters the most. Whereas in our behavior with other people, our actions really are what come first. What we think is great, it's very important. So an easy illustration of that is if somebody who's genuinely in need comes and asks 2 people of equal means for $100, and one expresses great sympathy and gives $1, and the other politely gives $100, but isn't particularly empathetic or emotional about it or encouraging, the $100 person is better. because this beggar needs the money, right? It's great if you could do both. It's great if your heart accompanies the actions, of course. That's the ideal. But of the two, were one to have to choose, the one who's doing more action toward his or her fellow neighbor, that's better. Whereas with prayer, let's say, what matters most is our intention. Much more so than what we particularly say or how long we say it. What matters the most is what is our relationship with God. It's the thought component of it that primarily dictates how meaningful that act is. So Ibn Ezra makes a really strong point, and I think it's a really fascinating point in terms of how he understands that. Okay, so that's Ibn Ezra. Okay, we're done with him. We move on to the next territory. I'm doing a lot of things in 1 hour, just you wait. Because each one of these things I think is really important. And so sometimes they fit together very nicely, and sometimes they're just different points that stand independent of one another. Contemporary scholarship adds here's the contemporary scholarship piece, ta-da. So we were doing some of each. In contemporary scholarship, there's been a big push and notice over the last, 40, 50 years, let's say, maybe even longer. But certainly by 40, 50 years ago, this became commonplace in academic study, that now we have access to all these different treaty-making techniques of the ancient Near East, which Ibn Ezra and other commentaries of the classical period, of course, did not. And one particularly curious treaty-making technique, which predates the Torah, are by a group called the Hittites. The Hittites, we think of the Hitti as one of the 7 Canaanite nations, because they had some outpost communities living in the land of Israel at the time of Moshe and Yehoshua. That's fine. But they also were a massive empire at that time, with their home base in what today is Turkey. They were big time. They were actually a very mighty empire for a while, right around the time of Moshe, the Hittite Empire. Okay, so the Hittites, because they were a mighty empire, that means that they had vassals, right? People who have empires, they rule over other countries. And so these lower countries are called vassal states. Okay, so the Hittites made treaties with their vassals, and the goal here is to make sure that these vassals are very, very loyal and that they never, ever rebel. Because if you're an emperor, that's what you want. You don't like rebellion. Rebellion is really bad. What you do like is lots of taxes. And you also want peace in the empire, because that's good for anybody, especially you. Okay, so when the Hittites made treaties, there was a certain protocol that they followed. And here's how it went. Take good notes here, folks, because this is really awesome if you've never heard this before. They always started with a preamble, where the suzerain, meaning the Hittite king, who was the boss, he would introduce himself and say, "Hello, my name is Hattusilis III," or whatever his name happens to have been. Hattusilis III was a Hittite emperor. That's why I came up with that random name. It wasn't so random, but it could have been whatever it was. So first, the king would introduce himself. Then he would give a historical prologue and say, "Here's what I've done for you lately, and therefore you owe me allegiance." Okay, that's what the Hittite king would say. Then he would demand of the vassal, "You better be loyal to me and to me alone." He would demand exclusive loyalty to himself. Then there would be additional stipulations to this treaty. Whatever other laws or requirements the Hittite king wanted. You have to pay 20% taxes. You have to pay 50% taxes. Whatever they demanded, that was the next part of the treaty. Then there would be curses and blessings. May you be blessed immensely by the gods if you keep all of these stipulations, and may you be seriously cursed by the gods. And P.S., I'm going to come after you also if you don't keep up with the loyalty treaty. And finally, this was always followed by a solemn oath taken by the vassal with witnesses, and the treaty was always placed in a very sacred location in the vassal state, like in his temple or something. Okay, if you're keeping score, that's exactly the protocol of the 10 Commandments. That's exactly what happened at Ma'amad Har Sinai. Obviously, the treaty between God and Israel is like no other treaty in human history, because it's Hashem, for crying out loud. It's totally different. It's an infinite covenant. But the protocol of treaty making that Hashem uses is one that was clearly very familiar to Bnei Israel at that time. So Hashem introduces himself by name. He says, "And I've taken you out of Egypt." That's the historical prologue. right? Here's what I've done for you lately, and therefore you owe me loyalty, and therefore you must serve me exclusively. Then there are the rest of the stipulations. This is the central part of this covenant. This was followed by the blessings and curses that, for reasons that go far beyond this shiur, appear in the Torah at the end of Sefer Vayikra, at the end of the book of Leviticus. But the Torah stresses that was said at Mount Sinai. That was part of the Sinai covenant over there. And then where was our treaty placed? Where were these tablets placed? They were placed in the Ark, in the Holy of Holies. The protocols being used by Hashem for Bnei Israel were protocols that were incredibly familiar, certainly to Moshe Rabbeinu, but also just to basic Israelites. This is how treaties were made in that world. And it's actually pretty striking how similar the treaty-making external protocol is. Okay, now I'm going to pause for just a second.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, please do.
Okay. If there were like a nation of slaves, I can understand if Moshe got it, but how could they, the rest of the people of Israel, be familiar with that, being basically enslaved by another nation, and them not having any access to anything besides being slaves?
It's a good question in general. So first of all, the type of slaves that Bnei Israel were, it's hard to imagine this, but remember that before they were slaves, they were zillionaires, right? They were the nobility of Egypt, protected by Yosef, provided for by the crown. They were doing very nicely. So the slavery that we had, which was terrible, I don't want to belittle the slavery, is very different from what we might think. All right, time out. Let me see if I can mute everybody. Hello. There we go. Very nice. I can do it. Love that power. All right. So getting back over to the main issue at hand. Oh,
give me more.
I don't have as much power as I thought. Anyway, I apologize. Whoever I wasn't able to mute.
I don't know how to use it, bro. I don't have an iPhone.
Here, there's
Whoever is making all that sound, can you please mute?
try mute all again. You see unmuted him.
Is that someone?
Everybody mute, please.
Yeah, please mute. Okay, so in the meantime, getting back over to here. So the Israelites it was state-imposed slavery, where suddenly the Israelites were forced to do hard labor by Paro and by the Egyptians, and they would be whipped if they didn't fulfill their quotas. But then at night, they went home to their mansions. Right? It's a weird picture to draw, but you have to remember they went back to Goshen, and still they had wonderful homes, and they had plenty of, not everybody was wealthy, but the Nisiim who left Egypt were wildly wealthy. I mean, people left Egypt with a lot of money, some of them, certainly not everybody. So where's all that money coming from? So some came from their neighbors. The Torah stresses even that the Israelites took wealth from their neighbors, but a lot of it was just, they packed their bags, right? So it's a different picture of slavery from what we are used to. And so you have to remember that at least the elders of Israel, they were very politically savvy. They were treated terribly. I don't want to belittle the misery of the slavery that we endured, not to mention the drowning of our baby boys for a time. It was terrible. But it's a different picture of slavery from what we might think of as the American South, or of European slavery, or so many slaveries more recently involving kidnapping, total ownership, total poverty, and then when they're released, even, they had absolutely nothing. We're dealing with a very different kind of picture as the Torah gives it to us. Okay, so getting back over to here. So your question is, how would they know? The answer is certainly the elders would know. I can't promise you that every Israelite at Sinai understood, oh, this is like the vassal mating, the suzerain vassal relationship. I don't know if everybody got that, but certainly the elders of the camp understood full well, wow, Hashem is entering a full treaty with us, where Hashem, of course, is the superior party, and we're the inferior party, as rightly it should be. And they would have understood the externals very well. My favorite, moving on to the next point, but related to this, my favorite piece of this puzzle was presented by somebody named Professor Meshulam Margaliot, who was the head of the Bible department at Bar Ilan University for many years, alav hashalom. So right when the internet became available to us regular folk, it was really something, right? So certain institutions were very visionary about, hey, we can disseminate Torah to the world. That was very cool. So two of the first institutions that really made a big deal about this were Yeshivat Har Etzion, aka the Gush, And the other one was Bar Ilan University, where they had Parshat HaShavua pages at Bar Ilan. And because it's a university, sometimes like math professors would get involved with the sticky math question in the Torah. It wasn't just the Bible department. It was actually very cool. So they did this for a number of years. I'm not sure that they have continued it. They did it for a bunch of years. So back in 1998, Meshulam Margalio wrote a little 2-page piece on Kitisa. And I read it a couple times over. I'm like, holy moly, this is amazing. I can't wait to share it 1,000 times over, if not more, over the next how many years. So it's in his name, Zachor Latov. So he raised an issue which reminds me of how sometimes we just miss a piece of our Jewish education, and I cannot explain to you why. Forgetting about ancient Near Eastern treaty making for a second. I was taught as a kid, as a fact, well, what I said before, there are 10 statements, or 10 commandments even, but 10 statements, 2 tablets, do your math, there's 5 and 5. Ibn Ezra's piece that I mentioned a little while ago is based on that as a fact. I was never told that there's another opinion in rabbinic literature, and in fact, I hate to say it, it's actually the majority opinion that somehow we all have chosen to ignore. So much so that in virtually every synagogue in the world, you will find in the front the 5 and 5 model. And by the way, don't change your synagogue's artwork, nor should you go to your synagogue's rabbi or president and bother either one of them about this. It's not that big of a deal. But from a learning point of view, it's a good idea to see that there is a different opinion. Because I'll tell you why this matters so much. When I was a kid, I'm sure when you were kids, you had the same problem. I love my parents, and I'm eternally grateful to them for so many things, and they're good parents to boot. So I'm really grateful for their bringing me into the world and raising me and all the sacrifices that you make as a parent raising children. And now that I'm blessed to be a parent, I hope my kids appreciate me in the same way. It's a miracle. There's really nothing like that. But we were taught that the first 5 statements are governing the relationship with Hashem, and the other 5 are governing our relationship with people, right? Well, number 5 over here is the problem. Number 5 is honoring your parents. And again, parents are fabulous. Obviously, we have a relationship with our parent that no other person can share. I get it and totally agree with that. But parents, I mean, when I was a kid, you learn that your parents are not God, let's say when you're in middle school. Now they learn when they're 2. You just know your parents are not God. They're very important to you. You love them. You're very grateful to them, but they're still not God. And therefore, that commandment should be on the other tablet. You could even put it on the top if you are so inclined. But keep the same order if you'd like. Hashem did that. But why in the world would you possibly put honor your parents on the Bein Adam L'Makom slate, on the laws governing between us and Hashem when parents are not Hashem?
Rabbi.
Hi, Nikki.
Rabbi?
It's good to see you. Yes.
Yes, Rav Soloveitchik, when I was a kid, one Erev, I think it was Yom Kippur, anyway, it was before Yizkor, and he pointed to the, we had on top of our own 2 tablets, and he pointed to the bottom saying, you see the honor your parents on the bottom on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, don't covet. He says, you know why they're on the bottom? Because they hold up all the others above them.
Wow. That's a very powerful point. I love it. And that's better than what they told me as a kid. Understandably, it's Rav Soloveitchik, nothing against my second grade teacher, but Rav Soloveitchik is the great thinker of the previous century and beyond. So thank you for sharing that. I was taught what the Talmud teaches, which is a good answer too. Parents are partners with Hashem in creating us. And that's true. It really is a miracle. There's no question that bringing life into the world is the single greatest miracle ever. It's amazing that people have any share in this whatsoever, and truly a blessing. But still, at the end of the day, honoring parents should fit under the category of our relationships with other people and not with Hashem, even if it forms the basis for serving Hashem also. Plus, I'm not an artist, but I married one. My art skills are 0. I would even say negative, but okay. I make good smiley faces for my kids, though, and they always appreciate those. My wife is a fabulous artist, but even I, the total non-artist who at least has good taste in who to marry, what synagogues do, synagogues abhor asymmetry. So the problem with the 10 Commandments is that if you actually do the 5 and 5 thing and took the trouble to write out the words, so the numbers 6 through 10 over here in Hebrew have 26 words, whereas the first 5 statements have a whopping 146 words. Terrible asymmetry. Okay, so synagogues fix that by just putting the first couple of words of each one so it looks very even, or Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud, that also works. But in fact, it would be terribly asymmetrical were we to write out the texts, the full text of the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. So we wouldn't just say that the commandments are divided over lengthwise. Okay, so I'm just raising the issue that the statement that the first 5 are Bein Adam L'Makom, governing our relationship with Hashem, and the other 5 are Bein Adam L'Chavero, governing our relationship with other people, it's 90% accurate. But wouldn't it be cool if we could have 100% accurate of something? So the answer is that there's another rabbinic opinion which nobody ever taught me. I learned it from this Meshulam Margaliot article, that it turns out that the majority of the rabbis in the Yerushalmi thought it was a different format. Here's source number 4. How are the tablets written? Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel says there were 5 on one tablet and 5 on the other. Baruch Hashem, somebody says what we all do. This is the opinion that just big time won. As it is written, he inscribed them on 2 tablets of stone. That is 5 on one, 5 on the other. Just to make sure that this is clear. This proof text is not a proof of anything. He's simply doing the calculator without, in the days before electronics. He understood that 10 divided by 2 tablets equals 5 and 5. But the pasuk doesn't say that it's 5 and 5. We just know it's 10 statements, 2 tablets. Okay? So that's how he comes to his conclusion. The rabbis say, meaning there's the majority view here, which nobody ever told me about, that there were 10 on one tablet and 10 on the other. In other words, these are duplicate copies according to the majority view of the Yerushalmi. Each tablet contained everything, which, by the way, is very symmetrical. And it also solves the problem of honoring your parents. There are no 2 halves between man and God and between man and man. It's just there were 2 copies of the same treaty. As it is written, he declared to you the covenant that he commanded you to observe, the 10 commandments. That is, 10 on one tablet and 10 on the other. And let me just stress again, this proof text is not a proof of anything. He's just speculating that there were duplicate copies. There's no pasuk that tells you that there are duplicate copies. Okay. So first of all, it's just good to know that there is a majority opinion which we have all, as a worldwide Jewish community, chosen A, to ignore, and B, I never even heard about it until 1998 when I read this piece. I don't know about you. I'm amazed that this isn't presented as an option, at least, as, okay, forgetting about why. So Professor Meshulam Margaliot weighs in, having quoted this source and a few others that say the same thing, and he says like this. He can explain the duplicate copy thing based on ancient Near Eastern treaty-making techniques, which is when you have 2 kings making a treaty, guess what? Everybody always got a copy. And this is very cool. Back to Hattusilis III. I knew I would get back to him eventually. In 1270 BCE, Ramses II, who might be the Paro that Moshe Rabbeinu was dealing with and whose firstborn got killed in Makkah Bechorah, like that guy, Ramses II made a treaty with Hattusilis III of the Hittite Empire. And this is cool. Archaeologists have dug up both copies of the treaty, one in Egypt and one in Turkey. And sure enough, they're the same because it was an equal treaty. So everybody gets a copy of this treaty. That was done around 1270 BCE ballpark. Okay. So then Meshulam Margaliot says, okay, it makes sense that you're going to have duplicate copies of the God-Israel treaty because, again, there are 2 parties to this treaty. There's Hashem and there's Bnei Yisrael. Okay, so far so good. But then he goes on. He says like this. Back in the good old days, it depends who is making the treaty because there are different kinds of royal treaties. You can have 2 kings that are equal to one another, like Ramses II and Hattusilis III. One is not the suzerain and one is not the vassal. That's an unequal treaty. When it's an equal treaty, then everybody got a copy of the treaty, and each king kept his copy in his palace. It makes sense. That's a good place to keep it. There's, I'm sure, some royal archive room, whatever it is, and they would keep all of these treaty documents in a nice, sturdy, safe place in the palace. But if you had an unequal treaty, suzerain and vassal, well, then everybody got a copy of the treaty, but the suzerain kept his copy in his palace, and the vassal kept his copy in the temple of his god, because it was a way of making a solemn oath to be faithful. All right, so we're obviously a very unequal treaty situation. It's Hashem and Bnei Israel. So where should Hashem keep his copy? In his palace. Where's that? The Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies, which is designated as Hashem's throne room. And where should we keep our copy of the treaty? In the holiest spot we have, namely in the Ark in the Holy of Holies, in our temple. So both copies end up in the Aron. And it represents perfectly what an unequal treaty between Hashem and Bnei Israel would be. So Meshulam Margaliot is speculating that's why the two tablets end up where they are. And he also believes that they were duplicate copies. So all I want to say is we can't prove that he's right, obviously, nor am I going to try to. But A, isn't that super cool? I think so, yes. And you can agree or disagree, but I think it's just fantastic. But whether or not he's right is immaterial. What does matter is that there's a second opinion, which actually was the majority opinion, that these were duplicate copies of the same treaty. So it's actually an excellent explanation of the majority rabbinic view that somehow has just fallen away from virtually every synagogue art in the world. Okay. So that all being said, so I think I've been trying to stress that Hashem, even though this was a singular covenant, seems to have been using very commonly understandable treaty-making techniques that at least the upper classes of Bnei Israel and the more educated classes fully would have understood what was going on. Wow, Hashem is making a lord-vassal treaty with us, and we're going to follow it the same way. But all of these parallels are external. These are the form. But then when it comes to the content, you realize, wow, this was a once-in-a-forever treaty. And scholars of the ancient Near East point out just how different the revelation at Sinai was from everything that you had. So scholars such as Umberto Cassuto, followed by Nahum Sarna at Brandeis University and other great scholars of the last century, point out, just based on their expertise, not only of Tanakh, but also of whatever extent ancient Near Eastern literature there is. Never in human history, before the Matan Torah, did anybody ever claim that a transcendental deity has even a relationship with people. The idea that Hashem is the cosmic creator of everything and still has a personal relationship with us, that was unheard of. Pagan people would have had no ability to understand how that works. That alone is a revolution of Ma'amad Har Sinai, and for that matter, the whole Torah. A second thing is, this is the first and only time in human history that an entire nation ever made a treaty or a covenant with their God. Nobody ever claimed this sort of event of any kind. This was a singular moment in our history, but it also was a singular moment in all of human history. Here's another very important revolution of the Ten Commandments, and for that matter, the whole Torah. The idea that all of our laws come from Hashem. They come from God. They do not come from a king. Kings in the ancient Near East made the laws because, hey, you're the king. You could do whatever you want and you could legislate. Hammurabi, the Hittites, the Assyrians, you name it. The kings legislated, and they never claimed that these laws were prophetically revealed to them. They said, I'm the king. I make the laws for my land. Hashem made our laws, and in fact, kings are answerable to the laws of the Torah. They're not above that law. Another very important revolution is just a consequence of having a treaty with Hashem. Whenever two kings make a treaty, they all sign on the bottom line. They make solemn oaths, but they all understand. In a generation or two, the landscape might be different, might be a different dynasty, there might be a war, all kinds of stuff could happen. This treaty is not eternal. This treaty is now, and who knows what the future will bring. Every king understood that. When we made a covenant with Hashem, we understood from that first moment, this Torah treaty is in fact forever, because Hashem is forever, and Bnei Israel are forever. So when Hashem made this treaty, it wasn't wink, wink, we know that your grandchildren there might be a different political landscape. There is no different political landscape. This was made as eternal from the get-go. Another very important revolution of the Torah is the fact that our Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments that we've been talking about, they're not just some external law that Hashem gave us. They're embedded in a narrative, starting from the creation and going all the way down to that moment. And that's what gives the Ten Commandments its meaning and justification. It's not that we have stories and we have laws. Everybody has stories and laws. That's not a revolution. But the idea that the laws are directly nourished from the story, nobody ever thought of that kind of thing before at all. And then the whole rest of Tanakh, meaning the whole rest of it, is judging Israel on the basis of, are we being faithful to this covenant or not? In other words, this revelation moment at Sinai is what then gives all the meaning to all future narratives from that moment onward to the very end of Tanakh and to this very day. This is revolutionary. Another revolution is the fact that Hashem wanted all Jews for all time to know the Torah. It's accessible to everybody, not to the priesthood, not to some exclusive elite somewhere where they then tell us what we need to do. Every last one of us is supposed to know the Torah and observe the Torah from within. Nobody had any concept of that at all, nor was that even a goal of any other society. There are many other revolutions as well, but I think I did a pretty good job summarizing some of them. The point is that specifically by focusing on the external treaty-making techniques that were just the common ancient Near Eastern convention of that time, helps us appreciate just how revolutionary the Torah was in its time and that it still is. Okay, so I'm going to pause here because I know that there's probably some chat stuff and I want to make sure to do as much as I can before we do that. I was Paul Rugaway in Seattle. Wow, cool. Well, that's very cool. I will try to remember to tell my dad because that's really, really neat. Thank you so much. Do we not say because the Karaites do? So again, I think I mentioned that a long time back. This cancellation of the Aseret HaDibrot in our service long predates Karaites. It has to do with much earlier sectarian groups. Okay, then there's something about, okay, I agree with that one. I need the sources. Okay, we did the source sheet thing. Okay, we're good. Okay, now moving on down. 10 Commandments said during the Second Temple, I thought only by the Kohanim in their area, not by Amcha, but it was said in the temple. So the idea that this was part of the temple liturgy as like the heart and core of our services, you would think that would extend to us now. Like
it was the heart and core of our services for the Kohanim only, and it's very problematic to assume that that was a guide for everybody else when prayer came about. That was the Kohanim, and the Kohanim had different purity laws and different marriage laws, and they did it. And as you point out, only in the Second Temple. We don't know what went on in the First Temple.
That's
to say that this was some kind of pattern for later on, I think is you don't have any basis for it.
You may be right. All I can tell you, again, historically, I have no idea what happened. All I can tell you, so you're correct in that objection. What I can tell you, though, is what we read together in source number 2, that there certainly was consideration of we should all say this even outside of the temple, meaning the rabbis did discuss exporting to all times, right? But they canceled it because of the heretics. So I think that is a basis. There was a sense that we should do whatever they were doing in the temple, but we can't because the heretics have these misguided ideas. But you're right, that never happened. You are correct about that. All I can tell you is that the rabbis certainly considered the notion of bringing it out, and honestly, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, if you count the Parshiot, sets gets you to 10. That's correct. The Parshiot are based on the traditional divisions, but again, in those Parshiot, some of them, the Parshiot are based on the Jewish breakdown of what these 10 statements are. But my point was just that with those 10, some of those statements have 0 commandments, some have 1, and some have more than 1. Okay, but you're correct about that. Avdil, sports fans stand up when something particularly exciting happens. I think that that's true. They could even do the wave. Sometimes they do the wave when they're bored, as a matter of fact, or they might stand up because their team is losing and they're trying to encourage them. There are many reasons why sports fans may stand, but definitely true. Do or do not, there is no try. Sounds very good. I think Yoda had something to say about that. Okay, good. Is there any relationship between the form of the 3-part area, form of the Mishkan, which was borrowed from the Egyptian traveling camp of the Paro, and the 3-part of the 10 statements? That's very cool. I mean, it's not too confusing. The answer is I don't know. What Ramban points out is that there's a strong connection between the Mishkan, exactly this 3-part division, and Mount Sinai, where Moshe going to the top is like the Holy of Holies. Aaron and the elders going onto the mountain, but not to the top, is like the Kohanim who enter the Kodesh, the holy section. And the rest of us who would be standing at the base of the mountain is like the Azara, the courtyard where anybody could access. So I think that's a straightforward analogy. In terms of the 3 parts of the 10 Commandments, that's Ibn Ezra's philosophizing. I think it's very cool philosophizizing, but I don't know that you can specifically liken it to the Mishkan. Yeah, I agree. Thank you for the meaningful anecdote about Rav Soloveitchik. I mean, I guess I said it. Also then, okay, next, the treaty between Ramses and the Hittite king, with the 2 copies each on stone, clay bricks, I don't know offhand. I had heard the theory about 2, but I'm sure this is find outable, by the way. I just don't know offhand. I had heard the theory about 2 copies over 20 years ago and not heard it repeated since. It makes so much sense, though. I couldn't agree more. It makes super duper sense. How does Margoliot explain the broken tablets? Do the Ark have 4 copies? Good question. He doesn't explain it at all. He's focused on the covenant making. I mean, look, the broken tablets, it's a fun question of whatever happened to that? Right. So there's a midrashic tradition that somebody swept up these pieces and put them into the ark too. But there's no mention of that in the Torah. I don't know what happened to the broken pieces. I don't know if people took them as souvenirs, if everybody was too afraid to touch them and they just left them alone. I really don't know from the pshat of the Torah whatever happened to those. But any, you don't need Margoliot for this. Any scholar of the ancient Near East would tell you that the idea of breaking the tablets, besides the sheer rage that Moshe Rabbeinu felt at that moment, is a sign that the treaty is null and void. Okay, the Yerushalmi brings down that there were 20 or even 40 on each luach. That's super cool. Please repost. Okay, thank you for reposting them. Other 2 copies because you can see them back in front. Again, that's not a pshat comment, although it is very cool. 2 copies are just because there are 2 parties to the treaty. Right? Hashem and Israel. So everybody gets a copy. In this case, since Hashem is quote unquote everywhere. So it's a little different arrangement from if you have Ramses and Hattusilas III making a treaty where 1 copy ends up in Egypt and 1 ends up in what we call Turkey. It's a different ballgame. But the idea of having 2 is because there are 2 parties to the treaty. Hey, I got through everything. Yes.
Yeah, one other comment. I also heard on the don't take God's name in vain. I always felt that I couldn't understand why saying, gee, damn it, would never be forgiven to me. So I heard from Dennis Prager, of all people, the comment that it really says, don't carry God's name in vain. And what is who carries God's name? Somebody who looks like a pious Jew, tzitzis, yarmulke, or with a Beckish and a Steimel, and then he's plastered on the front page of the New York Times for some major scandal. Right. And that God will never forget.
Very good. Very good. Who said, I missed, who said that?
Dennis Prager.
Dennis Prager, right. Okay, very good. So hold on one moment. Okay.
Could the 2 tablets be an anticipation of the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu himself would write a duplicate copy, having snatched his own?
Please forgive me. Can you try that again? I didn't hear you clearly, and I certainly want to.
Could the 2 tablets that God wrote with his finger anticipate the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu would rewrite the tablets in his own hand, so that what we have are not God's version, but Moshe Rabbeinu's version?
Very good. So I don't know. We're in concepts that are way over my head, but for sure you're right about what ended up happening. I don't know that God anticipated it. It sounds like plan A was, let's just keep the fixed ones, keep the first ones fixed and don't have a second set, right? That would have been better. Had there been no golden calf, we would have stuck with the God's finger one, right? But once that version is shattered, then you're right. Then it sets up what becomes Moshe Rabbeinu's version afterwards. That doesn't sound like that was the plan A. That sounds like what needed to happen as a consequence of the golden calf. But I think the point is well taken. I wanted to close out with 2 very brief comments of how this one line in chapter 20, verse 2 It's a great verse in its own right. I, Hashem, am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. Okay, that's enough. This sparked two fantastic debates that I'm going to summarize in 6 minutes, and then you can go explore them for the next 20 years because there's a lot to unpack here. The first one is this a commandment? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. Doesn't sound very commandment-like. It sounds like an introduction. But there are two camps within our tradition, some which agree with what I just said, that it's not a commandment at all, but rather a prologue to then the commandments, which come right after that. That's what it sounds like. And the other side, which says, no, this is actually a commandment to believe in God. People like Ibn Ezra and Rambam, Maimonides that is, and a few others make a big deal about this. They say that this is not only a commandment to believe in God, but by definition is the most important commandment. Because without belief in God, all the other commandments float. Yes, you could observe Shabbat without believing in God, but that's so weird, right? The whole idea is that we're observing Shabbat in the service of Hashem. Hashem commanded this, and it's because Hashem created the universe. Okay, so others, such as Behag and Abarbanel, disagree. They say there's no commandment here at all. This is an introduction. The debate that's really happening here, which took over in medieval Jewish philosophy, was, can God command belief? Because on the one hand, if God is commanding something, you sort of have to believe in God in the first place in order to believe in him. Otherwise, it's a circle. So the philosophers believed God is commanding belief. And what that means on a practical level is we need to study Jewish philosophy. We must study Jewish philosophy so that we can believe in God properly. Whereas the other team says belief is the foundation for the observance of all the mitzvot in our religious experience, but God can't command belief. So that's one massive debate that emerges from that verse. And the other one is also a really interesting one. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. That's fine. God is relating to the fact that just a few weeks before this revelation, he took us out of Egypt. That's an excellent way to start the commandments. This is the basis for the treaty. So Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi in his Kuzari says, well, that's the point. The point of Judaism is experience. God could have said, I am the Lord your God who created the cosmos. But the basis for the Torah and the whole rest of Tanakh is religious experience. God took us out of Egypt just a few short weeks earlier. And now because of that experience, we serve him. So the Kuzari turns that into one of the corner foundation stones of his entire edifice in his understanding of what Judaism is. Ibn Ezra comes along, I mentioned him earlier, and says, no, this verse that we have here says what it says, that I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, but that was written for the common masses folks. The common masses folks are not sophisticated, and so they can relate to the fact that God took them out of Egypt from slavery just a few weeks before. But any good religious philosopher would say, I'm the Lord, if all of us had been religious philosophers, God would have said, I am the Lord your God who created the cosmos, and therefore you should serve me. So Ibn Ezra proposes, he's the ultimate Pashtan, right? We think of him as this man is committed to what the Torah says. Here he stakes out his claim and draws his line in the sand, saying that the Torah was given to different audiences. You have the basic baseline audience, which is most people who are not very learned or sophisticated or philosophical. So God is to speak to them on a very base level. But there's a higher level that God clearly intends, according to Ibn Ezra here, that he's referring to the creation also for those who are sophisticated enough to have that. In my view of the world, I can't tell you what God was thinking behind the text. I have a hard enough time trying to understand the text. So that's what I spend my time doing. Kuzari is plainly correct that the Torah's whole anchor is in the experience that we have with God. And obviously we can rise to higher and higher levels of consciousness and religiosity and experience all through that. But Hashem very plainly seems to set out that the relationship really is at the basis of our relationship with God. That all being said, our time is up for today, but that's okay because at least we have 5 more sessions, so I don't have to get sad yet. It was a pleasure learning with you today. Thank you so much for all of your questions and comments along the way. I really appreciate that we're able to interact in that way. It's yet another one of the miracles of Zoom. I want to thank Torah in Motion for having me give this six-part series. And I look forward to seeing you next week at this time for the revelation narratives surrounding the Ten Commandments. That's what we'll do next time. So have a great day and great rest of week. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Thank you
Great
so
to
much.
see you again.
Uh,
Be well.
can I ask another question?
Okay, sure.
The second, whatever, davar, whatever the statement, when it says, לא יהיה לך אלוהים אחרים על פניי, ולא תעשה לך, it's already action. לא תעשה לך פסל ותמונה וזה. So the vision is not so clear. I could say also on Shabbat, Shabbat לעבדך ולאמתך ולדה, da, 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 da. So that could be also, for social.
You are
So I
completely
think-
correct. First of all, you could disagree with Ibn Ezra altogether. That's fine. But Ibn Ezra understands what you're saying also. He does realize that different commandments have different components to them.
Right.
So his argument is, what's the main one? So if you buy that, then I still think it's a very cool scheme.
נכון. What's the main one? I agree.
And that's all he's trying to say. I mean, in other words, that if you believe in another deity and then you have a statue of him, the problem is the belief. If you have a statue of Beethoven, okay, so there might be issues with that in halakha. There's some discussions over that. But at least if you don't worship Beethoven, then it's less bad than somebody who has an idol and they think that there's some spirit and hearing in it of some pagan deity. And that's what we're talking about over here. So that's his argument, that it's dealing with the main purpose of it all. Okay, so on that very happy note again, thank you all,
Thank
and I
you
look
very
forward to
much.
learning with you next week.